Welcome to today's lecture. We will continue our discussion on application of fluid inclusion studies to ore environment. Today we will discuss about an interesting Indian deposit, and since this work is an in-house work produced from our laboratory here, so it is just to given the intention here to just to take you through a course in which the fluid inclusion studies from the very beginning to from the occurrence of the ore in field, and then the different types of ore regimes, the fluid inclusion that is sampled from them, studied and then presented, and how the interpretation was made. Here it may be that the interpretations and the ideas which is presented here is not important, but they may be equivocal or they are subject to criticism, or they may be still be debated, but the idea here is just to take you through a process, since you will be those who will be beginning to learn and apply this particular technique to their research or their study and pursue this to learn as to how fluid inclusion techniques are applied. This is just as an example. So, this example has been taken from the Malanjkhand mineralizing system, which is essentially is a deposit which is hosted in a granitic rock, as shown in this map here on a local scale geological map in 1:50,000. We could see this yellow part is the one which is representing the mineralized ore body, and the grey part is the part of the Malanjkhand granodiorite, which occupies about the whole the total area of that particular pluton is about 1400 square kilometer, and within that this particular ore body it's actually about 3 to 4 square kilometer at the most. The length would be about 2.2 kilometers and the width would be about 0.8 or so, and the rock units which are shown here in different colors like green and yellow are the younger Chilpighat group of rocks which are not related to mineralization, and this we know is part of the northwestern margin of the Bastar Craton, which is juxtaposed with the central Indian tectonic zone, and the southernmost element of it is the CIS, the central Indian suture. So, this is the geological local mine scale geological map which shows this arcuate body, which is on the surface mine plan. It is a continuous body of quartz which is actually called as a quartz reef, or you can call it as a mega vein, running for about 2.2 kilometer in its length and obtaining a maximum width of even 100 meters at places, but an average of 60 meters or so, disrupted by later apletic small, you could see a small apletic body here, and also disrupted by later dikes, later mafic dikes, which are also conspicuously post ore. They do not have any role in controlling the mineralization. So, these apletic body and the mafic dikes are all post ore. Now, if we look at the different domains, the way the ore occurs in this particular deposit, this is a typical look of the quartz reef containing rich chalcopyrite mineralization, and that is the one which continues for 2.2 kilometer long distance. And the other situation in which that we could the surrounding granite does have these quartz, which we call them as stringers or veinlets of quartz. Near to the quartz reef they do have such kind of a parallel disposition, and in the moving away from the main medianly located quartz reef, which contains the bulk of mineralization, the bulk of the reserve is coming from this particular reef, and it has this kind of randomly oriented stringers, quartz stringers, sometimes quartz feldspar containing variable percentage of variable proportion of potash feldspar, and they are also mineralized. And the vein pattern sometimes on the exposures on the mine face scale also look like parallelly disposed here, but it is not possible to establish any such time relationship, because what is more clear over here is they do not possess any such kind of feature as typical stock work kind of vein network which generally is observed in the porphyry copper, young porphyry copper deposits, classic porphyry copper deposits we know that in the convergent settings in Chilean Andes and South and West American Cordillera, or in many of the other localities in the world. So, the work definitely. So, if we are interested to work out the ore fluid and try to characterize the ore fluid and to know what kind of a genetic category it could be belonging to, and even without not having an objective to classify to any existing known genetic type, just to understand the fluid characteristics in this particular deposit. Of course, with the ultimate objective that yes, finally when we synthesize the data, we do have to say whether it is a porphyry copper deposit or not a porphyry copper deposit. If not, then what? So, we sampled quartz from all these entities, the main of the quartz reef, which has a strike length of 2.2 kilometer. The only problem is that this quartz reef has undergone later shearing and brittle deformation, whereas these veins have survived such kind of later brittle deformation. And we sample the quartz from the stringers, we sample the quartz from the reef, we sample the quartz from mineralized thin veinlets like this, and also from here. And this diagram is just to give you an idea that this mineralized quartz reef is actually nothing but actually is a continuous body in 3-dimensional space, which is just giving you one drill core section reconstructed. They do have a down depth extension of almost like 800 meters or more, and at depth they generally have a composite sheeted kind of nature as it happens, and as all this interpretation goes, this quartz reef occupies a fracture zone within the granite. Now, what kind of fluid inclusions we see in them? Essentially, if we would like to, first question that would possibly arise, that whether this mineralization in the main reef and the small mineralized stringers in the granite are the same or anything different. So, you sample the get the samples and then look at fluid inclusions in them. So, when you see the fluid inclusions in them, we do not find any much of a difference so far as the fluid inclusion types are concerned. The fluid inclusions in them, so these are old photographs, aqueous biphase, I could say that they are the type 1, that is the most dominant types of fluid inclusions observed in the quartz reef as well as the stringers, and even there are some quartzo-feldspathic rich veins, we can call them as pegmatoid kind of vein, and sometimes also we get disseminations in granite, and we have different ore regimes. And when we see the inclusion types, we see that the inclusion types occurring them is very consistent, only with the fact that these type 2 inclusions, which are the aqueous carbonic inclusions, are rather very rare in the reef. I will come to that explanation later. And there are instances. So, we have dominantly 4 types of inclusions. The type 1 are the aqueous biphase inclusion as shown here. The type 2 are the aqueous carbonic inclusion with 2 liquid and carbonic vapor, and the type 3 are the pure carbonic inclusions as we have described them before. They either occur as in the typical monophase or appearance of a vapor bubble on cooling slightly from the room temperature. So, they are the pure carbonic inclusions, and then we subject them to microthermometric runs. What we observe is that the temperature range of homogenization that we get for the aqueous biphase inclusion is more or less similar in almost all the ore regimes that we have sampled. Even there are some veins which could be distinguished as containing molybdenite or greater proportion of molybdenite than chalcopyrite. They could also be categorized as something as a different entity during sampling and during categorizing them sample wise distribution of fluid inclusions. So, they also are similar. So, that gives a first hand information that the mineralization, the fluid that caused the mineralization in the main quartz reef, the rich quartz rich chalcopyrite mineralization, chalcopyrite pyrite mineralization, with variable concentration of magnetite and very small proportion of sphalerite, and this is and simple mineralogy. So, there they do not indicate having any difference in the fluid chemistry or the fluid characteristics as far the mineralization in different domains are concerned. And here, as you could see, the salinity is varying from almost very low to greater than 40 weight percent NaCl equivalent in both the dominant regime. The temperature of homogenization of the biphase inclusions not corrected of course for pressure also do have a maxima at about 160 to 180 degrees Celsius, and this also gives you an idea how we draw the histogram. In case of this, we take a histogram of 4 weight percent NaCl, and in this we take a 20 degrees interval in the class interval for the plotting of the homogenization temperature in the histograms. So, this gives us an idea that well, the in terms of the thermal regime, there is the characteristic of the fluid which was responsible for the mineralization are more or less the same. Needless to mention that this fluid inclusion work is very well corroborated with the mineral pyrogenesis only when we are sure that quartz deposition is a continuum and has spanned the deposition of the sulphide minerals in this deposit from a thorough textural study of the sulphide and silicate in this particular ore body. Now, the interesting situation here is that well, the type 2 and the type 3 inclusions are rather very rare in the reef, the quartz reef, main quartz reef, but in the stringers, vein ores and the mineralized stringers, molybdenite bearing stringers and mainly the chalcopyrite bearing veins which are very frequent close to the main reef and then generally die out as you move away from the main reef. They do contain carbonic inclusions, aqueous carbonic inclusions and pure carbonic inclusions. So, if we just as we were discussing about the thermobarometric exercise, so we have a rough idea about the temperature range. Only in the case of the, as we mentioned before, these type 2 inclusions are the difficult inclusions because most of them leak before their total homogenization temperature. The same thing also happened, and the number of data obtained from them is rather small compared to the total number of inclusions that were studied in this particular deposit. So, here I will be presenting you with a situation which is of course very rarely reported in nature, the intersection of aqueous inclusions themselves, which only as a requirement that they have to be coeval inclusions, they are in the same grain of the host mineral as a part of the 3-dimensional network, and the only condition is that the inclusion which is homogenizing at a lower temperature will have a lower density than the inclusion which is homogenizing at a higher temperature, which can be explainable as one of the special cases which I will not be discussing in details, but as far as the presentation of the data. So, they were all the salinity and density were calculated with the standard methods that we discussed, and these aqueous some such sets of coexisting aqueous inclusions, when we intersected their isocores for the reef ore as well as the stringer ores in all the ore types together, they generally give us temperature pressure values of about 600 bars to 1500 bars and the temperature within range of about 300 degrees to 200 and 220 degrees Celsius. Now, we could possibly have some ideas to what is the degree of pressure correction that we may be needing. So, when we do see the temperature maxima as about 160 180 going to 200 degrees Celsius, then we know that what's the magnitude of pressure correction we will be needing for such inclusions, and we infer about the characteristics of the ore fluid. So, in a way what we observe here that the gross thermal characteristic of this fluid is in no way comparable to the very high temperature magmatically derived fluid that we see in porphyry copper deposits. So, generally here a point of inference comes here that well, this situation is possibly different from what we see them in typical porphyry copper deposits. And then this is the diagram with the photograph which showed that the coexistence of the type 2 and the type 3, type 1 and the type 3 inclusions, like the one here. This is a type 1 aqueous biphase inclusion, and this is the type 3, that is pure carbonic inclusion. And we know that under this circumstance if we find them in the same grain of the host, as we can see here the photograph, they are very much on the same grain, just on a different plane. So this is why the type 1 inclusion is out of focus. So if we plot and we got about 10 pairs of such coeval occurrence of these type 1 and type 3 inclusions. There we see the temperature and pressure value what we get is all very much in conformity, about 550 to 1200 bars, and temperature within that 250 to 300, 200 or even less than 200 degrees Celsius, because this would represent a lower temperature regime where the fluid was actually in its immiscible to liquid condition. Then we could still expect a little bit of lower pressure and lower temperature. So they also conform to a 550 to 1200 bars condition. Now coming to the type 3 inclusions, as discussed before, out of a good number of such inclusions which are observed and whose compositional characteristics in terms of their partial homogenization of the carbon dioxide are obtained, finally just about 10 inclusions which are reasonably the small sized inclusions for which reproducible total homogenization temperatures were obtained, and all of them were homogenizing into the aqueous phase. And when the exercise which we elaborated during the thermobarometric exercise using our modified Redlich-Kwong equation and the methodology which was discussed, and we could see here that the pressure and XCO2 values that we arrived at are falling on the isotherms, and these give us a little bit of higher from 550 to about 1790 bars of pressure. This gives us an idea that yes, if the mineralization took place at more or less a comparable crustal depth, then the pressure condition must have varied from something which is intermediate to lithostatic, hydrostatic, or completely hydrostatic, and they would represent if it happens to be purely lithostatic to hydrostatic, then they would represent some 4-5 kilometers depth of the mineralization taking place, and if we make it to be a hydrostatic condition as 500 bars also correspond to that. So that would give us an idea that well, this particular mineralization, what is that temperature and pressure, I mean the depth condition of formation. So when you compare that, what is the situation as far as the mineralization is concerned, or we can better use this diagram to understand. So this is the host granite and this is the mineralization. So if the mineralization and the host granite were at the same crustal level, then we should get similar pressure also from the host granite. But when we did some thermobarometric exercise on the host granite, we got pressures of the order of 4.5 to 5 kilobars, representing about 13-14 kilometers depth of beginning of the crystallization of this granite. So we could assume that yes, after the granite actually started to crystallize, it definitely moved way up in the crust, and then finally after getting arrested at a lower it has moved at a shallower condition corresponding to 4-5 kilometer of depth, this mineralization took place. This scenario is also quite different from what we see in the typical porphyry copper situation. So now where we in this case we are plotting the paired salinity temperature data for the entire samples that we studied in this particular deposit. Now this is the salinity temperature diagram. We see that there is a lot of scatter, and we could possibly think of fluid mixing because of low salinity and moderate temperature to very high salinity, moderate temperature, and sometimes the temperature is also high. So this is the diagram where the temperature and density are plotted, and this only gives us a little bit of advantage because the data are compressed and we can interpret the data more conveniently if we put them on a temperature density diagram. So if you put on the temperature density diagram, it can be visualized that this particular situation, both same in the reef as well as in the stringer domains, the vein domains, we see the same path of evolution. We could consider them that there were two fluids. we could consider that this is the F2 fluid, which is which would correspond to a higher salinity and higher density, or moderately high, because here the salinity value cluster at about, the high salinity value can go up to 35 40 degrees centigrade, or maximum points are clustered about salinity of 25 to 38%. And then this if this could be imagined as the one of the component of the fluid, and this is another component of the fluid, and if we mix the two, just show as has been shown here on this diagram, the only thing is that any mixing process, if the fluid volume are unequal, then it will always be the larger volumes characteristic which will predominate, and that is what has happened, that is what is visualized in this case. So, we visualize that it is because of the mixing of two fluids, one signature is of a low temperature, a low density fluid, and a moderately high salinity and low temperature, moderately low temperature of the order of 200 degrees or so, because these are pressure uncorrected. So, this is the picture that could possibly be best explain the scenario. Now, if the two fluids are mixed, if this is the mixing domain, then how is it that we are getting fluids of higher salinity also in this situation? So, here as discussed before, when we construct such fluid evolution diagram, we only have the scope of considering the aqueous fluid, but then the carbonic fluid also has been an integral part of this ore fluid. So, is it possible to have or incorporate some of the features of the carbonic fluid and then visualize the situation, even though we cannot plot anything on here. So, what actually is possible, that okay, if we this is the F2 and this is F1 and this is the mixing line, and this box would represent the maximum in the deposition of the host mineral quartz along with the sulphides, then the further increase, if we go to the salinity diagram also, it will be more clear that we have further increase in the salinity after the mixing of this particular fluid. Now, here the carbonic fluid characteristics could possibly be considered here. So, as we know that if there is a mixed aqueous carbonic fluid and then this particular fluid is undergoes unmixing, means it separates, a carbonic fluid is separated out of the aqueous fluid, then the solubility of the salts will be very negligible in the carbonic component. So, the remaining aqueous component would have an apparent increase in its salinity, just as it happens in case of a boiling, when the vapor phase gets separated out of it, because of the negligible solubility of the electrolytes in the vapor, the residual liquid gets apparently more higher in its concentration of the total dissolved solid, and there is increase in salinity in a boiling condition. A similar kind of situation could be visualized, that there is increase in the salinity of this fluid after the mixing process, and then after only the unmixing of the fluid took place, which is very much supported by occurrence of pure carbonic and pure aqueous inclusions in this host mineral. So, the occurrence of pure aqueous and pure carbonic inclusion testifies to this kind of unmixing process, and very elegantly explains that well, this mixing process brought about the deposition of the quartz sulphide ores, but then after that the fluid unmixed because of further drop in temperature pressure condition from changing from lithostatic to hydrostatic or situation where the unmixing took place and the fluid became more saline with this unmixing process. So, this is just only very it is only a process like of how an idea can possibly evolve, how the fluid inclusion data could be integrated and a model of fluid evolution could be depicted. Now, this as I told that this fluid evolution diagram, whatever we visualize, it has to be corroborated from other independent considerations also. If it is corroborated, then the model is more trustworthy, and if it is not, then will always be subjected to some questions and needs to be later clarified. So, in the ore assemblage, so here what exactly we are visualizing? We are visualizing that there are mixing of two fluids. Now, which is not shown here, when we examine the fluid characteristics in the host granite, in the granite quartz, there we find that the salinity temperature characteristics of the fluid in the granite quartz has similarity with the F2 component in terms of the temperature and salinity characteristics. So, we presume that the majority of the ore fluid was actually contributed from the granite, where the fluid was actually present, internally evolved into a low temperature and moderate salinity characteristics, and that fluid actually converged when this structure was created. When this structure was created, then fluid from the fluid present in the granite in the structure network, actually it converged into the main fracture zone where the mineralization took place, and in this fracture zone only the mixing of the two fluids took place, because there is one main source of the fluid which came from the granite, and there is another source, another fluid which is suspected to have played a role on the site of mineralization, and that is possibly the one which might have carried the sulphurous species and brought over the mixing and the mineralization process. So, is it possible to have such a situation where there will be two fluids, one fluid will have dominantly the metals, so let us say iron and the copper, and most of the majority of the metal is actually taken or contributed by the granite, evolving from the very stage of its crystallization evolution process, and converging into the fracture zone at a later stage, modified in its temperature and salinity characteristics to a moderate saline and low moderately low temperature. If that fluid is channeled through the fracture zone and is now mixed with a fluid which is little higher in its temperature, but lower in salinity, but could possibly be charged with this sulphurous species, then such kind of a mixing is could possibly be accompanied by such kind of inorganic reduction of the sulphate species to give rise to magnetite, and then releasing of the sulphurous species, reduced sulphur species, either in the form of HS minus or H2S. One can write such a reaction in a way so that either it could be HS minus and the H plus ion being liberated, or H2S and also similarly H plus ion will be liberated. So, what is the consequence of such kind of mixing process is that when we in the ore we see that there are magnetite, or this magnetite are early, and later on give way to a sulphide stage of deposition of minerals like pyrite and chalcopyrite, then this early magnetite is very much associated with extensive chloritization of the ferromagnetic minerals present in the granite. So, this possibly in the close vicinity of the ore body. So, what we could visualize that from a fluid inclusion data, the mixing process and the consequence of mixing as giving rise to mineralization with attendant with the sulphide, when they will be precipitated, there will be increase in the pH of the fluid, and then the unmixing of the aqueous carbonic fluid to aqueous and the carbonic component, and such also would result in late calcitic veins, very much agrees with the observed fact, even though they are very small in proportion. And also the situation corresponding to a chloritic alteration of the ferromagnescians in close vicinity on the granite, where such kind of a reaction, and this chloritic alteration will be very well explained by liberation of the H plus ion, which will, so initial this H plus ion will be consumed, or will be this ferromagnetic mineral will be acting as the sink for the H plus ion which is generated with this kind of process. So, as a case study, I mean right or wrong, such kind of systematic investigation, beginning with the looking at the ore body, its mode of occurrence, different types of the different ore domains, the mineralization, and then sampling the appropriate host mineral, because in this case we have not studied any of the fluid inclusions in the sulphide minerals, which one can always follow it up, and then do a systematic fluid inclusion studies on the different ore regimes and then look for what kind of differences they do display, or they are all the same, and then from the fluid inclusion diagram integrating the results obtained from the all types of inclusions, even this aqueous biphase, aqueous polyphase and the aqueous carbonic inclusions, and then look at the fluid evolution diagram in such a way that it could give a very coherent picture of fluid evolution, which should also corroborate with the observed mineralogical and associated alteration characteristics in the ore and the surrounding rocks. So, we will continue with our discussion on some other typical ore types, important ore types. So, we will continue. Thank you.